Association with A.P. Martin. 1894. In 1894, Augustus P. Martin was appointed to the chairmanship of the Board of Police and came to the office where I had already served 9 years. I had never previously met him, though from his having been for a long time prominent in the commercial and social life of Boston, I knew him by reputation and had seen him in his accustomed place on Sundays, at church. At one time he had been mayor of the city. In fact, it was just 10 years previous to this that he had served as mayor, and it was during the year immediately following his term of office that the amendments to the city charter previously mentioned went into force, under which the Board of Police was created, to which he now came as its head. The 5 years of his term of office, as head of the police department, were crowded full of serious and responsible work for him, and I was allowed to have my share in it, as one of his assistants. During those 5 years I seemed to be living under a sort of paternalism, different from anything I had ever known. He was, in public office, what I imagine an old Roman patrician might have been. He was like a father to all young people who were in the employ of the department, of which he had charge, especially to women. The invasion of the business world, by women, had taken place mostly in his day, and he believed that this step was freighted with incalculable benefit to both sexes. He had the faculty of appealing to and calling out the best in his subordinates. The geniality of his nature and the kindly courtesy of his manner made themselves felt like sunlight in the quarters which he occupied daily, and during all my experience in office life, I have never known a man more loved by other men than was he. Men were glad to come, if for a few brief moments only, into the warmth of his presence, and seldom one left it without feeling better for it. This is not my own prejudiced opinion merely, for I have heard his occupancy of a public chair characterized as dignity, sweetness, and light. He listened patiently to the complaint of the poorest petitioner for justice, or applicant for assistance. And, in cases which called for the rendering of a judgment, he generally showed himself possessed of a wisdom and a sense of justice, such that his friends often jokingly told him that he had missed his calling in life and should have been a judge on the bench. But, with all his gentleness of manner and kindness of heart, his mentality was original and forceful. He did not always follow in the footsteps of his predecessors. It was his habit, first to decide upon what policy it was best to pursue, and then, if ordinary methods were not adequate for putting the policy into effect, to devise others. Not that he never erred in judgment or in conduct. In fact, he was one of the most natural human beings I have ever known, and humanity does err. His naturalness was his charm. But I am not writing a biography. The general, for as such he was popularly known, left the police department at the expiration of his term of office, in the spring of 1899, and it was in the fall of that same year that I gave up my position also. The association seemed to have come to an end. October 5th was the date of my leaving. On October 16th, a certain psychic, Mrs. G., whom I saw occasionally, told me that I was to go back to my old position, that something more was to be required of me. And, on November 30th, another psychic, Mrs. S., told me practically the same thing. They were both very positive in their statements, and both said I was to go back for a short time only. I set these predictions down at once as incorrect, for my feeling against returning was so strong that I thought no possible inducement could take me back. On December 13th, I had persuaded General Martin, who was then at leisure at his home, to accompany me on a visit to one of these same psychics, Mrs. S., who prophesied for him, in plain language, that another high office or position was to be offered him. Then came my first private sitting with Mrs. Piper under the new regime, previously mentioned, which took place on December 20th, at which I was accompanied by Dr. Hodgson. Dr. Hodgson had chided me, taking the ground of worldly wisdom, for having resigned the position I had held so long, not understanding all my reasons for so doing. But, when I appealed to Imperator as to whether I had done right or wrong, the latter unhesitatingly replied,
"Right, and made the way for a new life, new scenes, new enterprises, new conditions, whereby thou wilt be completely thine own master, regret not thy act."
And Dr. Hodgson had, of course, to submit to the opinion of the personality, for whom he had so great a respect. In speaking of future work, Imperator said,
"There are many that are thy friends, and who would give thee much help and will without any effort of thine own. Remember, friend, we often say, 'Seek and ye shall find.' In this case we say, 'Seek not, and if we be obeyed, every detail will be made known to thee.' We see thee receiving communications from thy past surroundings, which will verify all we now give utterance to."
It happened that Josiah Quincy, who was mayor of Boston that year, just before leaving the mayor's chair, and as almost his last official act, appointed General Martin to the position of water commissioner for the city, which position he accepted, and took up his duties in the beginning of the year 1900. This was a complete surprise to me, and I understand was an equal surprise to the appointee. On January 12th, I received a request from the new water commissioner to present myself at City Hall for the purpose of rendering him some assistance, although not then as an employee of the department. On the very same day, the 12th, to my astonishment, I received a letter from Dr. Hodgson, saying that Imperator had especially asked him to arrange another sitting for me with Mrs. Piper. That I was to go alone, that it was important for my own good, after which, it might not be necessary for me to go again, for some time. I went to City Hall on the 15th. I did not feel at all certain, in my own mind, that it was best to engage myself in a position there permanently. Imperator had hinted new fields, new scenes, etc. I was a little puffed up by these suggestions, and although it was a pleasure to assist General Martin in any kind of work, I secretly hoped that my service in government departments had come to an end, that the monotony of my life was to be broken, and that I might take wing for some distant spot, I cared not where. On the 17th I went again to Mrs. Piper. Imperator said,
"Thou art being cared for in all ways, and we have thy interests at stake, friend, and we are leading thee in the right way now. Let us tell thee that within a few short weeks thou wilt see a great change in thy life for the very best. A position will be given thee without thy seeking it. As we were closing our last meeting, we saw a light before thee, of which we could not then speak, and we have chosen this opportunity to do so."
Very shortly after this, I was appointed to a position in the water department, and the old association was renewed. City Hall being only a stone's throw from the old locality, I therefore considered that the prophecy made by the two psychics was almost literally fulfilled. Imperator, however, seemed to see this still more clearly and said,
"We warn thee not to re-enter the former surroundings. We desire thee to keep apart from it altogether, and we ask thee to dare not disobey our leadings."
He had seen me receiving communications from my past surroundings, which was correct, but did not see me going back to the identical position in the police department. All three psychics saw the same event, which was to take place and did take place, Mrs. Piper seeing it more clearly than the other two psychics, as I reread my notes today. I have thought best to give these items in detail, in this particular instance, since they all are so closely related. The subject of foresight, however, is one on which I do not wish to express here any definite opinion whatever, nor to assume an understanding of it. Coming events cast their shadows before, which we ourselves, with our normal sight, can sometimes perceive. It is human, especially when one is in trouble or doubt, to want to know something about what is to take place. But it is not dignified to seek to know about the future, to the extent of having one's serenity disturbed in the performance of the duty of the day. In fact, it seems to me that it is only in the conscientious performance of the daily duty, without undue anxiety about the future, that desirable changes are brought about. We bring them about ourselves. We work steadily toward them and, by some occult law, we draw to ourselves that which we really need, that of which we are deserving and for which we are prepared. Outward affairs, in the life of a serious-minded person, seem to follow and correspond with inward change and growth. Apparent failure of prediction, 1900 to 1902. To go back to the sitting of January 17, 1900, with Mrs. Piper, mentioned in the preceding chapter. Of all the sittings which I can remember, this one made the deepest impression upon me. After a few lines of script, the pencil was dropped from the psychic's hand, and the voice taken, and, for nearly 2 hours, conversation was carried on. Before the time was up, I threw away my own pen and paper, gave up the effort to take notes, and had a heart-to-heart talk with the trance personalities. It was my first experience with Rector's use of the voice. His style differed so greatly from the familiar style of Finuit, or even from that of my friend Hiram Hart, that, I realized at once, that I was conversing with a different individuality. He was so dignified, so kind, so sympathetic, so serious, so desirous of assisting me to lift my life to a higher level, that I was almost overcome. How these newly found spirits, whoever they might be, should know so much about me, I could not understand. I thought myself a stranger to them, but they seemed to know me through and through. They saw in me capacity, which I only half recognized in myself, and they seemed to think me worthy of their time, their effort, their assistance. And they endeavored to convince me of the fact that my life was of some importance and must not be undervalued by me. The period of 14 years in one spot just then ended had seemed long and difficult to me, yet Imperator now called it only a short school for thee. So brief, evidently, do the decades seem to the discarnate eye, which takes in the wider span. Hiram Hart came and said,
"Oh, I bless the day when I found you here. I do not see you very often now. I come here and take a look and do not see you and then go away."
Here means at the scene of operations, the point of communication, which is always where Mrs. Piper happens, for the time, to be located. But the most important statement, made to me by Imperator on this occasion, in speaking of my again being associated with General Martin, was the following.
We see thee and him writing a book together.
I asked, what about?
It is concerning the natural things in life and many different conditions of thy life which will be put together in a form of philosophy. It will be so in spite of anything which thou mayst think to the contrary.
It was true we were able to work well together, or so at least I flattered myself. Both the commercial world and the official world today are full of just such combinations of men as directors and women as right-hand assistants. A woman, serving in the capacity of private secretary to a man whose mind is filled with the affairs of his office and whose time is precious, should be able to adapt herself to his peculiarities, complement his weaknesses, and stand respectfully and safely aside from his strength. Women have an intuitive perception of these things, and even a young woman who has not had experience is often easily able to adjust herself to the requirements of such a position. At any rate, when in a haphazard selection, the right combination is formed, a better than the ordinary grade of work ought to be expected, and more than the usual amount can be accomplished. I will say here that, as far back as when I was at school, I made up my mind that, whatever else I did, I would not attempt to become an author. That was not to be my field. Others were more naturally fitted for it. I must have other work to do. Later in life, when I found myself struggling along in doubt and mental darkness, and occasionally the solution of some problem would relieve my mind, I flattered myself secretly that sometime I might gather together, into a sort of whole, the solutions of the various problems which had presented themselves to me, and inflict the mass in printed form upon others. Still later, I came to the conclusion that every problem, without exception, with which I had battled, had been met and solved ages before I was born. I found that the wisdom of all the great philosophers had been handed down and was accessible to all who could read, and, therefore, I again dropped the idea of ever entering the field of authorship. Not that it is a difficult thing in these days to write and publish a book of some kind, but I concluded that there were too many books in the world. The world would be better off if there were only half as many. But when Imperator marked out my path for me, in the manner above given, I confessed to at least a little surprise, and on another later occasion, when I remarked to him that I did not wish to publish a book, simply from a sense of duty, he replied,
Friend, to write a book, it is thy doom or duty, one and both combined.
I did not speak of this particular matter to General Martin. He was eager to hear all I was willing to report, but while I gave him much, I also withheld much. I simply told him, in a general way, that it was said we were yet to do some special work together. I was afraid and ashamed to tell him. I had long before learned to keep prophecies to myself, until I saw some sign of their fulfillment. He was a man of family ties, of many cares, burdens and responsibilities, both in his private and public life, and especially when illness came upon him. I could see no possible way by which any work of that kind could be done. I will say here that he did not specially pursue the subject of spiritism, in the sense of seeking mediums and paying attention to what they had to say, yet he was altogether too open-minded and simple-hearted to scoff at it. Soon after my making his acquaintance, he related to me an interesting experience of his own, which happened very soon after the death of his mother, who died when he was a young man of about 21, and to whom he had been attached with more than the usual devotion of son to mother. A servant in the family, young and quite ignorant, gave indications of being controlled by the spirit of his mother within a short time after her passing out. Giving her maiden name, Veral, a very uncommon name, and one which the servant could not possibly have known. I cannot relate the incident in full, my point being that it made an ineradicable impression upon his mind, and was sufficiently serious to cause him to refrain from speaking lightly of such matters, when he found anyone deeply interested in them, had he otherwise been inclined to do so. During middle life he attended the church of the Reverend Minot J. Savage, for something over 20 years, rarely missed a Sunday, and took a leading part in the management of church affairs. He was an admirer of Mr. Savage's independent thinking, and all the old attendants at that church know that there was a great deal of what might be called spiritualism in Mr. Savage's sermons. He sat in his chair at City Hall for somewhat over a year, then one day in March 1901, he was taken ill and obliged to remain at his home. He was, however, continued in office by two mayors, Thomas N. Hart and Patrick A. Collins. This was one way in which his conspicuous service of the past, to both city and country, was recognized by some of his friends, citizens of Boston of substantial character, who had power and influence in the management of public affairs. But I wish to state here, in justice to him, that during almost the entire length of his illness, his mind remained clear. He was knowing to all the important affairs of the department, of which he had charge, and himself dictated its policy. It devolved upon me to travel back and forth frequently, almost daily, between City Hall and his residence in the suburbs, carrying bills and papers of all kinds, getting his signature to them, and taking back his orders. I remember one instance in particular, when he dictated an important letter, assigning newly appointed subordinates to their respective places and duties, a letter which was remarked upon, when I took it back to the office, for the clearness and terseness of its expression, and for the authority which it conveyed. But this was a weary summer, that of 1901. The suffering sick were languishing in the extreme heat, and, for the well, there was the dead monotony of life's drudgery and the heartsickness which comes from hope deferred. I had not had access to Mrs. Piper since November of the preceding year. The transpersonalities had not sent for me, and it was not my habit at that time to ask for sittings. All signs seemed to be failing, and the ground, which I had thought solid, seemed to be slipping again from beneath my feet. I think, however, Dr. Hodgson made it known that I desired a sitting, and on January 13, 1902, at a sitting of his own, the following came.
Also, Miss Robbins' friends hath tried in vain to reach her. I, Rector, in particular. But friend, we fail to reach through light sufficiently to give our messages clearly.
Dr. Hodgson replied.
She thought she got a few words, I believe, from you through another light.
Light is the word commonly used by the transpersonalities for psychic or medium. Rector said.
Imperator sent me several times, but I was not sure that I had reached her.
This certainly implies that Imperator and his group do try, or have tried on occasions, to communicate through other lights when there is special need of their reaching those over whom they assume to have charge. What they do in the way of experiment is another matter. I had recognized on 1 or 2 occasions what appeared to be an attempt, on the part of Rector, to communicate with me through natural but undeveloped psychics. I felt strongly that such an attempt was being made. A sitting was arranged for me to take place about a week later, on January 22nd. From that time on, for the next 2 months, I was constantly receiving, through Dr. Hodgson, messages from Imperator and Rector, and sending messages to them. For, strange as it may seem, although the sick man whom all these messages concerned knew very little, almost nothing, about Imperator and his group, the latter apparently took a very great interest in him. I delivered to him a few messages, which I thought might give him hope and comfort. And I think I must certainly have given him the impression that my own feeling, in spite of all misunderstandings, was that, just as soon as he passed through and emerged from the shadow of death, there would be for him a welcome on the other side, of which he little dreamed. At least, that was my hope. But the important point here, in its relation to psychical research, is that I believed, from the many emphatic statements made to me by a group of spirits, that I was to be required in the future to assist in a field of work which they considered most important, that there was a particular person with whom I was to be associated in that work, perhaps more closely than with any other. Yet that particular person was dying. While the object I have in view compels me to speak freely of serious things, I trust no one will dream that there is aught in my heart but the utmost reverence for everything associated with that most mysterious change through which all human beings must pass, and which comes to none but once. Although I had been bereft of certain relatives and friends, it had not hitherto fallen to my lot to sit often or long at the bedside of the sick, but to watch a fellow creature who is gradually and surely approaching the end of life, who will not stay his feet for protest, tear, or prayer, to almost see the soul as it plumes its wings for flight, is certainly an experience which should produce the greatest awe in the heart and the mind of the watcher. The actual date of the passing out was March 13, 1902. While General Martin was a man widely known in his own city, he had little reputation which extended beyond this limit, except in connection with the War of the Rebellion, in which he served during its entire continuance. He was complimented by General Meade for distinguished service at the Battle of Gettysburg. It was on the 3rd and last day of this memorable and terrific fight that his battery, which had been located with immense difficulty on the summit of a rugged hill, had a clear sweep of the open field, over which Pickett's division of the Confederate Army made its famous charge, rank after rank of which were mowed down by the steady firing from Little Round Top, and the tide of battle was turned. The Boston transcript said of him at the time of his death, hardly any other of Boston's citizens was better known, and few had contributed more than he of time, talent, and activity to the military and civic service and functions of the city. He fitted best into those free movements of citizens, called into being by special occasions, and expressive of local patriotism and public spirit. It was the recognition of this fitness that secured his selection as Chief Marshal upon two of the most prominent commemorative occasions within the last quarter century. And he was sure to be prominent in all projects for the development and improvement of his city. He was not a general in the army, nor did that title rightfully belong to him until the year 1882, when Governor John D. Long, afterwards Secretary of the United States Navy, upon whose staff he was serving at the time, commissioned him, lawfully, Brigadier General, in recognition of his valuable services during the war. Another newspaper article, which appeared at the time of his death, says tardy justice was thus done, and he thereafter bore a title truthfully, which he had long borne by courtesy. It may be evident later that the title which best fits a person's character, the name by which he has been most intimately known, and by which he is most endeared, clings to him after he has passed to the other side,